The ride began like any other late-night taxi journey in Madrid, with Ronaldo climbing into the back seat of an aging Volkswagen, whose driver had been working the night shift for 23 years. And when he gave the address to his home in the wealthy La Finca neighborhood, the driver named Francisco glanced in his rearview mirror with mild curiosity, but showed no signs of recognizing one of the world's most famous athletes. His attention focused entirely on navigating through the quiet streets, where his worn taxi represented one of the few signs of economic activity during the early hours, when most of the city slept peacefully, while working people like Francisco continued earning modest livings that kept their families housed and fed through dedication to jobs that were essential but rarely appreciated by the customers who benefited from their services. Francisco had been driving taxis since 1998, starting when his construction job had ended due to a workplace injury that had left him with chronic back pain that made physical labor impossible, but hadn't prevented him from working jobs that required long hours of sitting behind the wheel of vehicles that were often uncomfortable and poorly maintained, but provided steady income for men who had few other options for supporting families whose needs remained constant, regardless of their fathers. Physical limitations or the economic circumstances that had forced career changes in middle age when starting over was difficult, and alternative employment was limited. The conversation that developed during their 30-minute drive through Madrid's empty streets was initiated by Francisco, whose curiosity about his passengers' obvious wealth led to questions about work and success that revealed his own philosophy about money, effort, and the satisfaction that came from honest labor regardless of its financial rewards. And when Ronaldo explained that he was a professional footballer, Francisco's response was characteristically thoughtful and grounded in values that prioritized character over achievement, hard work over talent, and service to family and community over individual recognition that might bring fame but didn't necessarily indicate moral worth or contribution to society's essential functions. The discussion that followed touched on topics ranging from the nature of work and success to the responsibilities that came with wealth and influence, with Francisco sharing perspectives that had been shaped by decades of driving taxi while observing Madrid's social and economic changes from the unique vantage point of someone whose job required interaction with people from every segment of society, from wealthy business executives and celebrities to working-class families and immigrants who relied on affordable transportation for access to employment and services that were essential for survival and advancement in urban environments, where public transportation was insufficient and personal vehicles were unaffordable luxuries. Francisco's observations about inequality and social responsibility were informed by daily experience with customers whose different circumstances and attitudes revealed character traits that were often independent of economic status. And his stories about generous passengers who tipped well despite modest means, and wealthy customers who treated service workers with disrespect or indifference, provided Ronaldo with insights into how money affected people's behavior and values in ways that were not always predictable or positive, and how genuine character was revealed through treatment of people who provided services rather than through achievement or accumulation that impressed peers but didn't necessarily demonstrate moral development or social consciousness. The moment that would define their encounter came when they arrived at Ronaldo's gated community and he attempted to pay the fare plus a substantial tip that was intended to show appreciation for Francisco's thoughtful conversation and professional service. But the taxi driver's response revealed principles about money and dignity that surprised and impressed Ronaldo with their clarity and consistency. As Francisco accepted the exact fare but firmly refused the additional money that he characterized as unnecessary generosity that would create an uncomfortable imbalance in what had been a pleasant conversation between equals who had different economic circumstances but shared human dignity that didn't require financial expression to be meaningful or authentic. "Keep your tip," Francisco said with quiet dignity while returning the extra bills that Ronaldo had offered. "I enjoyed our conversation, and you were respectful and interesting to talk with. But I don't need your charity, and you don't need to pay extra for treating me like a human being, which should be normal behavior that doesn't require financial reward. And besides, you'll need that money more than I do, because wealth creates obligations and pressures that I'm grateful not to have. While my simple life provides satisfactions that money can't buy, and responsibilities that I can actually fulfill through my own efforts, rather than depending on advisors and managers to handle complexities that come with the kind of success that you've achieved. The explanation that followed revealed Francisco's understanding of wealth and its complications, his contentment with a life that provided adequate income for basic needs, while allowing him to maintain independence and direct control over his work and relationships, and his belief that excessive money created more problems than it solved, for people who lost connection to the simple pleasures and clear purposes that characterized working-class existence, where success was measured by family stability, personal integrity, and contribution to community welfare, rather than accumulation of possessions or achievement of recognition that often came with costs that weren't immediately apparent to people who pursued such goals without considering their long-term implications. Ronaldo's surprise at Francisco's refusal to accept the tip was matched by his growing appreciation for perspectives that challenged conventional assumptions about money, success, and happiness. And their continued conversation in the taxi revealed philosophical differences about wealth and its purpose that were grounded in fundamentally different life experiences, but shared concern for human dignity and social responsibility that transcended economic circumstances, while suggesting possibilities for mutual understanding and respect between people whose material conditions were vastly different, but whose values about honesty, hard work, and family commitment were remarkably similar despite the different contexts in which those values were expressed. The insight that Francisco provided about wealth and its obligations was both challenging and liberating for Ronaldo, who had been struggling with questions about how to use his resources responsibly while maintaining authentic relationships with people whose economic circumstances were different from his own. And the taxi driver's matter-of-fact acceptance of his own limitations, while expressing contentment with achievements that were modest by celebrity standards, but significant in terms of personal satisfaction and family stability, provided an example of how success could be defined in terms that had nothing to do with public recognition or material accumulation that often failed to provide lasting fulfillment or genuine security. The business card that Francisco eventually accepted contained Ronaldo's contact information and an invitation to continue their conversation, not because Ronaldo wanted to force charity on someone who had clearly rejected it, but because he recognized that he had encountered wisdom and perspective that could be valuable for his own understanding of wealth, responsibility, and the kind of life that provided meaning beyond athletic achievement and commercial success. And Francisco's willingness to maintain contact suggested that he too had found value in their exchange of ideas about work, money, and the choices that shaped character and determined satisfaction, regardless of economic circumstances. The friendship that developed over the following months was based on mutual respect rather than economic disparity, with Francisco serving as an informal advisor whose insights about Madrid's working-class communities, social problems, and practical solutions informed Ronaldo's charitable activities, while providing reality checks about the effectiveness of well-intentioned but poorly designed assistance programs that sometimes created dependency rather than empowerment, and whose grounding in everyday struggles and simple pleasures helped Ronaldo maintain perspective about his own life and career that could easily become disconnected from normal human experiences without input from people who lived those experiences daily. The charitable foundation that emerged from their friendship was characterized by Francisco's influence toward practical assistance that preserved recipients' dignity while addressing real needs without creating dependency or undermining people's sense of personal agency and capability. And the programs that were developed reflected understanding that effective help required respect for people's autonomy and recognition of their strength, rather than assumptions about their deficiencies or need for salvation. that characterized some celebrity charity work that was more about making donors feel good than actually improving conditions for people who needed assistance with specific problems, rather than general rescue from circumstances that were temporary, rather than permanent. The community advisory role that Francisco eventually accepted involved no financial compensation, but significant influence over how charitable resources were distributed, with his knowledge of working-class Madrid providing guidance about which needs were most urgent and which approaches were most likely to succeed in helping families achieve stability without compromising their independence or self-respect. And his insistence on visiting programs and meeting recipients personally ensured that charitable work remained connected to real people and actual needs, rather than becoming abstract exercise in tax reduction or public relations that served donors' interests more than recipients' welfare. Years later, when Francisco had become one of Ronaldo's most trusted advisors and closest friends, despite never accepting any financial compensation for his counsel or assistance, when their friendship had influenced dozens of charitable programs that reflected working-class values about dignity and self-reliance, when Francisco's taxi had been replaced by a newer vehicle that Ronaldo had purchased through a third party to avoid violating his friend's principles about accepting charity, Ronaldo would reflect that meeting Francisco had taught him more about wealth and its proper use than any financial advisor or business consultant ever could. Because Francisco had demonstrated that true wisdom about money came from people who had lived without it successfully, rather than from those who had accumulated it, and that the most valuable guidance about using resources responsibly came from those who understood both the potential and the limitations of wealth for creating meaningful change in individual lives and community conditions.